Hello everybody, it's just gone the hour of 12. Welcome to today's event, the focus of which is Cities Outlook 2025. We're going to explore the findings and we're going to explore the implications of those findings for policy at the national and local level. For those of you that don't know, Cities Outlook is the Centre for Cities annual economic snapshot of urban Britain. We've been doing this for 18 years. This is the 18th edition, and it sets out how the 63 biggest cities and towns across the UK are performing across a range of economic indicators, and then obviously what does that mean for national and local policy. Obviously the context for this year's Outlook is a relatively new government which has as its guiding ambition to increase prosperity in all parts of the country. And 6 months into that government, we know that growth is still sluggish. The government's been busy in certain respects in terms of its policy agenda, but nevertheless, growth is still relatively sluggish. So 2025, I think, is going to be a pivotal and important year, not least because we're going to get an English devolution bill, following on from the white paper that we had right at the end of 2024. We're also going to get a planning and infrastructure bill, which will take forward the government's ambitious housing programme, and we're going to get an industrial strategy and part of that local growth plans. And we should all see that in the first half of the year, because in the middle of the year, give or take, we're going to get a spending review, so we'll know what the funding envelope for the next 2 to 3 years is going to look like. So a lot's happening, and we're going to need to see quite a bit of delivery moving from words to actions. So this year's Outlook really looks at the relationships between wages and how wages then relate to productivity, and how productivity relates to the cutting edge of the economy. As always, we're interested in the geography, these kinds of things, and how it varies across the country. So that's the special focus of Cities Outlook 2025. My colleague Paul Swinney, as many of you will know, is going to take us through the findings from that particular piece of analysis that we've done. It's outlined in the report, which is online. That'll take 20-25 minutes or so, and then we'll get into some Q&A from you, questions, comments, queries. Put them in the Q&A function as per usual, and we'll get to them in due course. Particularly, I think we're interested, obviously, your reflections on the findings that Paul's about to present, but also your own thoughts about how you think the government's agenda around devolution, around industrial strategy, and around planning, how they're faring. What would you like to see as we get into 2025? What would make a difference from your perspective? So put your thoughts in, and we'll come to them in the second half of the session. But without further ado, Paul, hand over to you to take us through the main findings.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Cities Outlook presentation. I'll just share my screen now and get on through. So hopefully, as many of you will know, being an annual health check on the UK economy, Cities Outlook is packed with stats across a whole range of different policy areas or different areas of the economy, telling you how the 63 largest cities and towns perform. So that goes from productivity to employment rates through to greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. But this year, every year, as is the case this year too, we have a special focus on a particular item. And this year it looks at wages and what that then means for the industrial strategy. So the main section is called Pocket and a Pay Rise. Now, question is, what do wages look like across the country, and then why does that matter? So first chart is this one, which is a particular favourite of mine. It looks at wages at the workplace level, so basically where the jobs are, what are average wage levels, and looks at it across different regions, both in terms of urban and non-urban as well. And there are two things to draw from this chart. The first one is that in every region of the UK, urban areas are more productive, pay higher wages because they're more productive than non-urban areas. And the second one is that there's a much greater amount of variation between urban areas than there is between non-urban areas. Now, broadly, what that tells us is that In terms of where the reason why we see variation across the country is because of the difference in urban areas, and in particular, the underperformance of some urban areas in parts outside of the Greater South East. Which you can see there on the left-hand side, some of the highest wages, particularly from the urban perspective. When you look towards the right, Midlands, North and Wales, not doing particularly well, especially because of the underperformance of those urban areas. And there's a lack of gap between urban and non-urban. So let's delve into, that hopefully that tells you why cities are important. But let's look at the terms of that variation that we do see across the country. And this chart is quite a nice illustrative way of trying to understand it. What it does is it says, right, how much does the average worker in Burnley earn for the whole of the year, for the whole of 2024? And then let's look at average worker in other cities and how far across through the year did they get before they earned what the Burnley worker earned in the whole year. The headline from that is that the average worker in London is earned by August what the average worker in Burnley earned throughout the whole of 2024. But you can see there that it's not just London where that's the case. There are other cities, particularly in the Greater South East, where that applies to too. So Slough, Crawley, Reading, Cambridge, all earned by August what the average worker in Burnley has earned in a year. And then you've got places like Aldershot, Edinburgh, Milton Keynes, Cambridge and Aberdeen earning by September. So it really shows the scale of these differences that you do see across the country and the challenge that we have around pay. But it's all very well sort of noting that pay is different across the country. I think what we see here is that the scale is perhaps larger than maybe what people might appreciate, but people do understand that wages do vary. The key question for the industrial strategy when it comes forward, and the local growth plans that will come forward too, that the government has asked mayors to write, is why is this the case? What drives this? And that's what Outlook gets into to try and better guide those local growth plans in particular. The headline reason why is what this chart shows. It's that productivity, that thing that economists get excited about, but doesn't really mean anything to normal people, is what drives these wage differences. So this chart shows average wages up the left-hand side against productivity measured by GVA per hour along the bottom. And what you can see there's a positive correlation between the two. The more productive a place is, the higher wages they are. And that's because you have higher paid jobs in these places, you're generating higher wages, putting more money in people's pockets. But actually, we take this a little step further, and that when we are thinking about what drives local performance, we need to understand which part of the economy is driving this, because then it allows you to target in rather than thinking about the whole economy of a place. And if we split the economy into two groups, we have local services, so that will be businesses that sell very much to a local market, be that cafes, bars, hairdressers, conveyancing solicitors, those types of activities. So they fit within local services. Then we've got a second part of the economy, which we would describe as exporters. Now that's exporting to an international market, but in the city context, that's also about exporting beyond its borders to a regional or national market too. These jobs are the ones that bring in money from outside of the economy, and then people can then go and spend it. And if we look at the performance of these two groups, the productivity differences between these two groups, we then see something very interesting in terms of what's going on and what that might then mean for where we focus policy. So those local services, the cafes, bars, restaurants, are the dark green dots towards the bottom. And the productivity of the exporters, the manufacturers, the IT, the finance, etc., they are the green dots. And what we can see here is that the light green dots, they're both green dots. What we can see in terms of the dark green dots is that there's actually very little variation across the country. That isn't what's driving these overall differences in wages. And also productivity is pretty low. You can see there that those dark green dots are way below those light green dots in almost every city that we look at. Where the real variation is coming from is in those light green dots. And again, you can see there that Greater South East cities like Slough, Reading, London, and Aldershot towards the left-hand side there, very high productivity economies. Whereas you then go across to the right-hand side, you can see greater number of places in the North and Midlands, like Doncaster, like Burnley, etc., where their productivity, their export base is much lower. This prosperity engine is not working as well as what you would like, and that's then having this knock-on impact on wages. So it's really, really important when we're thinking about national strategy, but also local strategy too, about focusing on this export base. Is that prosperity generating engine performing as well as what it should be? And then what should we be doing about it? So then we want to understand, well, let's look at how well that export base is doing. And we do that across 5 different measures to understand and try and give a bit of guidance for these local growth plans about the types of things they should be thinking about if they do want to be improving their export base and they do ultimately want to be putting more money in the pockets of the people who work in their cities. So let's run through those 5 things. Number 1 is size. If you have a small export economy, if your exporting part of your economy isn't really playing a very big role in a wider local economy, you're going to have a challenge there in terms of how much prosperity that can generate. And that's exactly what this chart shows. The measure across the bottom is a measure of size. I won't go into the technical details, but basically, if you're towards the right, you've got a larger export economy. If you're towards the left, you've got a smaller export economy. And it plots that against wages. And you can see there's a positive relationship between the two, in that if you have a larger export base in your economy, perhaps unsurprisingly, then wages are higher as a result. And certainly on the right-hand side there, you can see a number of cities in the Greater South East, some of them picked out there, like Reading, Slough, Crawley and Cambridge. Relative to the size of their city, their export base is large. That's generating a lot of prosperity, which then translates into wages. Whereas on the left-hand side, again, you've got places like Bradford, Huddersfield, Burnley, where their export base is actually pretty small, and that limits the amount of prosperity that is generated. So that's number 1, size. Number 2, composition. And in particular, we're looking at here the cutting edge of the economy. How successful have places been in attracting in those cutting edge firms, those emerging sectors that are going to drive growth of tomorrow? And here again, you see quite a lot of variation across the country. And in terms of the share of the amount of these cutting edge companies that you have, contribution they make to their export base, again, it's cities in the Greater South East that have been much more successful at growing these green shoots, at cultivating, tomorrow's economy and attracting in these high-paid, these cutting-edge companies, which then has a knock-on impact on pay. So it's the composition of the export base is important too, particularly really that frontier, that cutting edge, and the ability of places to attract these types of firms in. And every place should be looking at how many of these types of firms it has, and then if it hasn't got them, why is that? And focus on trying to reduce those barriers. The third one is adaptation. So we went back through to the 1980s, as far back as we could get on the data, to look at the export base and the composition of it. And what we saw back at the start of the 1980s is that every city bar one had over half of their export jobs in manufacturing. Fast forward to 2023, the year of the latest data, and that's flipped. And there's only one city that has more than half of jobs in manufacturing now, and that's Burnley. So all places have been through this very big adaptation phase where they've moved away from manufacturing towards services. What we can see from this chart here is that those places that have adapted the most, that have moved most into services, are the ones that tend to have higher wages. So again, share of the exporting base, which is in services along the bottom, against average weekly wages, positive correlation, and it's those cities in the Greater South East that have fared the best because they have been able to adapt most. They'll move more into a services-based export economy, which is then generating a great amount of prosperity. Now, that isn't to say that manufacturing won't be important in the future, but we do know from the past that we do tend to focus a lot on manufacturing and advanced manufacturing in particular at the cost of probably not looking at what a place doesn't have and forgetting that services element of it. And I think if particularly those places towards the bottom end, if they are going to be more prosperous in the future, they do need to focus more on that service element rather than perhaps getting too focused on what this means for manufacturing. So there's 3 of the 5. Those first 3 very much do have an impact on wages today. The following 2 don't necessarily have an impact on performance today, but we do think they'll have an impact on performance tomorrow, and it's important to view it in that context. So let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is diversification. What this map here shows is that while we don't really have one-horse towns today in the way that we probably did during the Industrial Revolution, there are some places that are much more reliant on single industries than other places. So the bigger the dot, the bigger that reliance, and it really sort of picks out some of those one-horse towns that we do see. Aberdeen comes top. Almost 1 in 2 of Aberdeen's jobs is related to the oil and gas sector, and that has fallen in recent years, which has had implications for Aberdeen's performance. But you can see that Plymouth is also a place which is very reliant on one industry, boat building in its case. Doncaster, Wakefield, Sunderland, but Reading Reading in particular, and Aldershot and the Greater South East too. Now, we know from Reading and Aldershot that being very focused on one industry isn't necessarily a bad thing for performance today, because they have got high wages. The key question for them, as is the case for the other ones too, is that if these sectors start to falter, what does that then mean for future performance? And we've got a long history of those places that have previously been very focused on one or two sectors, then that sector has started to fall away and their economy has really struggled as a result. And I think it's a particularly strong message here for when we will have, no doubt, in the local growth plans of the rallying call of building our strengths. We need to build on our strengths. The question is actually, if you're a little bit overexposed in particularly a lower skilled industry already, it's probably what you haven't got, which is the big issue, rather than noting that, oh, look, we have a lot of jobs in automotive, or a lot of jobs in boat manufacture, or a lot of jobs in oil and gas. But we need to be very careful about that message, because if that industry starts to falter, it does have issues for the future. Then the fifth and final one is about the roles that different parts of an economy play in that economy. Now, what this chart here shows is it looks at those new economy firms again and says, where do they locate? So those concentric circles on the left-hand side split the UK economy into 4 areas: city centres, suburbs, hinterlands around cities, and then deep rural areas. And that chart on the left-hand side looks at area. So we can see there that cities account for about 8.7% of land, city centres in particular just 0.1% of land. So actually quite small parts of the country when you look at it from an area perspective. If we move then over to the right-hand circle, this shows us the distribution of those cutting-edge companies. Where are they based? And you can see there that cities account for just under 9% of land, but they account for about 61% of all of these cutting-edge companies. So they're very much clustering within urban areas. Cities are playing a very particular role, which relates back to the comments in the very first slide about higher wages in cities than elsewhere. But perhaps the most striking thing about this is the role of city centres in particular. So 0.1% of all land, but over 18% of all of these cutting-edge companies are being based in city centres especially, which is telling us something about the benefits that city centres offer to high-paid, cutting-edge type businesses. Now, this, in principle, has a very big implications for the roles that different parts of a city or a city region are playing. So I think if you were a mayor that looked over or governed over, let's say, the Northeast or the East Midlands, which has both urban and rural, it tells you something about the particular role that the urban plays in terms of attracting in these cutting-edge companies vis-a-vis some of those more rural areas, which means that in the local growth plans, they'll need to focus on the role that plays and trying to boost performance of the cities in particular. But it shows a second thing, an even more important element, which is about the role of city centres. Now, what's interesting, as you'll see in the report, is that if you look across all cities, there isn't necessarily a relationship between share of the new economy in city centres, or how strong the city centres perform today and how high wages are. But we do think that in the future that these city centres are going to become ever more important. And so if a place hasn't got a functioning city centre economy, or it's not performing as well as what it should, that should mean that an alarm bell and a focus of resources as a result on trying to turn that round and making the city centres in particular more attractive places to do business. So they're the 5 indicators that we run through. This chart tries to pull that all together for 2 places, and it looks at Bristol and Doncaster. Now, Bristol has very high workplace wages, £756 per week. You can see in the top left-hand corner there. That's about £150 more per week than is in Doncaster, where wages are £604. Now, this radar chart shows how well these 2 cities perform across those 5 indicators I've just shown you. If the points are right in the centre on any one of those indicators, it's got a weakness. If it's further out towards the edge, then it's got a particular strength in that area. And these 2 places are quite extreme examples to show actually the difference that you see. So Bristol there, you can see, performs well across the 5 different areas. It's got a large export economy with a lot of cutting-edge firms. Quite a large share of that is in service-type activity. A lot of it is based within the cutting-edge element is based in the city centre. And it's got quite a strong diversity of sectors that make up its exporting economy too. It's not over-relying on any one sector. Whereas Doncaster, you can see that it's very much the opposite. That it's the green shape is very much smaller. So the The dark green shape is very much smaller than the light green shape. It's got challenges across all 5 of those areas that the Mayor for South Yorkshire's plan will need to be thinking about if it does want to make Doncaster a more prosperous economy than is the case today. But just how prosperous should we trying to make these places? Are we trying to make them exactly the same? Well, the goal of policy should be about trying to make places the best possible versions of themselves, of which there are a number of places that can see an improvement, compared to where they are today. But at the same time, it's really important to note that best possible version of itself isn't necessarily the same as is the case in some other cities. So let me try and illustrate that to make that a little bit clearer. So this chart here, which is figure 19 in the report, in case anybody wants to have a closer look, does some modelling, and it's the results of some modelling. And it says, of all of those cities across Britain that we think as centre cities are underperforming using the modelling that we use, what is their potential? What is it should we be aiming for? What is the best possible version of Burnley, and where we're trying to get it to? But that chart's probably a little bit complicated in terms of the presentation, squinting on the screen. So let's zoom in on 2, and let's look at Burnley and let's look at Manchester. Now, these 2 are quite interesting because when we do our modelling and we look at the increase in wages that you would see in Burnley and Manchester, the back of the envelope modelling would suggest that actually the increase in wages would be fairly similar. In order to get Burnley to the best possible version of itself and Manchester the best possible version of itself, you're seeing an increase of about £80 a week in terms of their wages. But there are 2 things to note from this. First is that the best possible version of itself for Burnley, that light green dot, is quite a way behind the best possible version of Manchester, and actually would still put it behind the today's national average in terms of wages. So there will be an improvement in Burnley. We should be trying to do that, but at the same time, we don't think that you're going to get Burnley among some of the highest paid places in the country, even if you do put more money in people's pockets, which we think there's scope for policy to do. The second one is that from a national perspective, Manchester is just much bigger than Burnley. So even though you might see a similar increase in wages in terms of from current to potential, because Manchester is much larger, it's home to 19 times more jobs than what is the case in Burnley. That impact you're going to have on both the regional economy and national economy is much larger if you see that same increase in wages in Manchester as you would see in Burnley, which really I think helps us focus our minds in terms of when we're trying to place national resources, what that means and what we think the scope is for policy for trying to improve the economies of these 2 places. We can definitely do things for Burnley, but we do have to note in the context of what it is that policy can achieve and what that might mean for the national economy when it's coming to thinking about the performance of those big places compared to the performance of some of those smaller places. So what does that then mean from a growth plan perspective? Let me run you through five principles that the research tells us, which hopefully will be fairly obvious given what I've just presented in the preceding slides. So number 1, places when they're doing their local growth plans should focus on the exporting part of their economy. That is the prosperity generating engine of any place. You need that firing if you're going to put more money in people's pockets. Number 2, do focus on cities, but city centres in particular in terms of their attractiveness to the cutting edge of the economy especially. 3, be very wary about identifying key strengths. Having a key strength or a concentration within one industry might actually be a sign of what you haven't got rather than what you have got, so don't lose sight of that. 4th, be very wary of the key sectors of the government then undoubtedly will pick out when it does publish its industrial strategy white paper. And again, we tend to sort of obsess about different individual sectors, but those places that have got the strongest economies are the ones that have been able to attract in cutting edge businesses from a range of different areas, which tend to co-locate with one another anyway. There's much more about how you make yourself attractive to the cutting edge, rather than trying to slice and dice out into even smaller areas where actually policy has little control over whether it's going to be fintech or AI or whatever it might be that drives tomorrow's growth. And then 5th and finally, understand at least how to achieve inclusive growth. So again, hopefully I've laboured the point that this export part of the economy is really, really important, as opposed to, say, the everyday economy, which some people focus on, or the high street or other areas, which tend to be fairly interchangeable words. Now, the everyday economy, the high street, is an outcome of a strong performing economy. We really do need to focus on getting that bit right and generating the growth, so then we can spread that growth round rather than just focus on distributional issues. Because if we don't grow the size of the pie in a Burnley or a Wakefield or a Sheffield, we're not going to have an increased amount of resources to go around, an increased amount of prosperity to go around. And it's really about improving that performance, that growth engine, getting that growing, so we can then have a conversation about spreading the growth rather than talking about spreading the growth before we've even generated it in the first place. So that gives you a whirlwind overview of what the main focus of Cities Outlook is this year. But as ever, as I said at the top, there's a huge range of materials that we produce off the back of it. There's the report, but there's the data tool as well, which you can, if you're like me, you'll have lots of fun playing around with for many, many hours. Maybe you're not like me. You can listen to the podcast that me and Andrew did, summarising the findings, and you can read the blogs on the blog too. And all of this are on our website at centreforcities.org. I want to say thank you very much. I'm going to end it there. And Andrew, pass back over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for a great summary. Paul said we've had a couple of questions about all of the slides we'll make available after the event. Obviously, you'll be able to watch back the presentation and, on the video as well if you want to. And obviously, all of the slides that Paul just presented are all in the main report itself. So if you get onto the website, centreforcities.org, you'll be able to find everything. Paul's going to come and join me and magically appear in a moment, and we'll just go through some of your questions. By all means, we've got some, but if you've got more that you want to add in, and particularly, as I said, any of your own comments or reflections on where you think the government's agenda is, particularly but not exclusively around English devolution. Obviously, we've written and talked a lot about that. Industrial strategy, very much the focus of Cities Outlook 2025. Any thoughts on that? And then obviously there's a broader planning and infrastructure programme as well the government's introducing. Maybe we'll come back to that in sort of reflections on that. So by all means, put some of your thoughts in and we'll work through them. Paul, just to start off, we've had a couple of questions, just bits of clarification, also touches on some of the other work that we've done beyond Outlook, but really relate to it. So one of them is Oxford and Cambridge doesn't appear to have a very large export economy, but is doing very well. What's our thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So partly I think this is down to the size of the public sector that exists there, particularly universities, which are having some interaction with that export sector and are particularly attracting in some of those cutting edge businesses that they both have. So there's sort of something slightly different that's going on within Oxford and Cambridge. But I think there's a broader point to make about their performance too, and that they are pretty small places. And while they get a lot of airtime in terms of looking at some of the cutting edge activities that go on there, the contribution to the national economy as a result of them being small places is pretty small. And so in some degree, we give a little bit of overemphasis, I think, to their performance. Now, what that really tells us about these places, and we've got a blog due to go up on this, is that if we want Oxford and Cambridge to be making that bigger contribution, they've already got strong economies, it just needs to be much larger. Now, part of that then is down to more houses, more infrastructure, more building in these places to increase them. But there is actually, we're then talking about pretty substantial increases. Now, I think Cambridge probably has shown the appetite for this in the last 10 to 20 years when you look at the house building that it is done, particularly relative to the 20 to 40 years before that. Oxford probably less so. But if we do want to be having a serious conversation about the contributions that Oxford and Cambridge make to the national economy, we are going to have to build more houses. And I'm not talking, small amounts of houses. I mean, if you're really going to be extreme about this, you're talking about a doubling of the number of houses that exist within these places. I'll leave it to the viewer about what they think about how politically feasible that is.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, we've got a question from Chris Taylor, which touches on one of the things you just mentioned, and it relates to the work we did a little while ago looking at the innovation economy and what was driving it. So have you looked at the role of quality higher education in supporting cutting edge companies? The answer is yes. Paul can say a bit more detail. There's a report you can get on our website called Innovation Hotspots, which very much looks at where these hotspots are of cutting edge economies and what's driving them. And one of them is to do with the interaction between those cutting edge companies and higher education. If you want to add a bit more to that, Paul.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of the tools that levers that people want to pull, isn't it? Always is the universities in those in different parts of the country. It was quite interesting, I think, the findings that we came up with when we looked at this. So it's definitely the case that research-intensive universities, so not universities overall, but research-intensive universities do seem to have some sort of organising influence over where some of these cutting-edge companies are based, and they tend to cluster around these research-intensive universities. What was quite interesting from the research, though, is that having a research-intensive university didn't increase the volume of these businesses necessarily, it just changed where they were based. Now, what we weren't able to do through that research is to say what impact that had on then the productivity of those companies, on the size of those companies. And you can make a very strong, plausible argument, which would be, being close to Oxford or Cambridge means that you're spinning out more complex ideas, you are commercialising something which is of higher value, and therefore the value to the UK economy is greater by being based next to these universities. But infuriatingly, we don't have the data to be able to tell us that. So that's something currently, so that's something for a future piece of research. So yes, there does seem to be something going on. The story probably isn't as clear-cut as maybe what you would expect, but certainly I think the high number of new economy firms, cutting-edge firms in Oxford and Cambridge would suggest that those institutions in particular seem to be having some sort of impact on the location of these types of industries.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And interestingly, I think the work also highlighted the importance of sort of big or bigger technology and innovation firms and the way that they were acting as, they were themselves acting as catalysts and anchors for firms of different types as well. So not just universities, but actually big firms that are in those sorts of industries and sectors, particularly if they're at the technology end.
Yes, definitely.
Another sort of reflection, I think, again, draws on lots more work that we've done, Graham Bannister or Graham. Decent transport to access learning and earning is so important to growth. Have you considered this element in your analysis? Yes, on many occasions. And yes, we do show both the importance of it and then particularly where it's a bit more problematic in some places, and there it's one of the factors we need to address as well. And that's about thinking about the overall business environment. One of the business environments is allowing firms to find workers and workers to find firms, and that's about the size of the labour pool, and that's about the transport system and enabling a functioning labour market that actually happens. So very crudely, we want labour pools in places that are akin to the way that the transport system in London allows us to have a very, very, very large labour pool in and around London.
And it's exactly that how we should be thinking about transport interventions. The economy clusters in certain places, in cities in particular, because of the benefits that these urban areas offer. One of them is access to workers, having that deep pool of workers and hopefully high-skilled workers. And there are two parts to what makes that up. One is, have the workers within commutable distance got the skills that are required, which is skills policy. But the second one then is, are they able to commute within reasonable time into where the jobs are, which is transport policy. And I think from an economy perspective, we should be thinking about transport in those realms of how to try and deepen that labour pool for cities or other large towns that we're looking at, and think about in that perspective rather than just transport for transport's sake, which I'm not saying that anybody on this call would do that, but sometimes some of the transport conversations do seem to get into those realms rather than think about what's this for, and it should be about trying to expand those deep pools. Now, I think what we have to understand within that is that there are two forms of transport. You've got public transport and you've got private transport. We tend to focus on the public element and maybe over-focus on that in some areas, even if the private transport is okay, and then probably ignore the skills element of the equation. And I think if we say, look at a number of cities across the north, skills tends to be a bigger issue than transport, with the exception probably being, the biggest cities in the north or public transport, when people are trying to get into the centre of Manchester or the centre of Liverpool or the centre of Leeds, public transport is important in that respect and probably will become ever more important. And so then I think that's where the public transport conversation becomes really interesting, which is when you're trying to funnel a large number of people in a very, very small area, public transport has the edge, and it's thinking about that plus skills. Whereas in some other areas, they may not have got a great deal of transport investment in recent years, but actually is transport the binding constraint, to use the current terminology that people like to use. The question is probably not, it's probably more on the skills side, and for each place you just have to make that very clear-headed assessment about which one it is or what the mixes are of those things.
Great. Questions are coming in fast and furious now, so we'll continue to work through them, so trying to pick out some. So I've had a couple of questions on, I guess, choice and prioritisation, partly about some questions about the 5 sort of principles that you laid out, Paul, and then other questions about where we think the government is now. Obviously, as you said, in the Green Paper, there were the 8 sectors broadly defined, with an ambition to go narrower into the White Paper. We'll see where we get to on that. But just on the 5 principles, particularly a couple of questions on Principle 3, which is key strengths be wary of, or at least understand. In a sense, when do we know when something is a strength versus not being a strength? And your point was, just because you've got lots of something, that might tell you something, but it might not necessarily be telling you that it's a strength. So just unpack that a little bit, particularly for places that are thinking about the analysis, thinking about their economies and such.
But undoubtedly, I think, as I said in the presentation, there will be, I'd imagine in most local growth plans, they will say something like, we have key strengths in X, Y, and Z. Now, that may be true, but also maybe it should be exposed to a little bit more deeper thinking. So instead of picking out a place today, let's sort of go back 20 or 30 years or 40 years even now to think about what happened in the past and how that played out and what that might guide us. So you can imagine that in the early 80s, a place might have said, we've got a key strength in coal mining. Look at the amount of jobs in coal mining. 50% of our export base is made up by mining. Therefore, what we need to do is double down on that coal mining because we've got a lot of it. Now, I think there are 2 elements there. First is, just because you've got a lot of something doesn't necessarily mean that it's a key strength. You've got a concentration of something, but if it's a concentration of low-skilled jobs, that's probably part of the reason why the economy is not doing very well in the first place. The second one is, if, as we know with the history of mining or shipbuilding or other heavy industry, we know that actually a lot of it diminished over the 4 decades which have followed, and actually having that key strength in that area, or concentration to be more accurate in that area, was not a good place to be in. And indeed, in separate work we've done, when we've looked at how well places have performed relative to how concentrated their economies were at the start of the 80s, we see that those places that weren't diversified are the ones that have struggled the most. So if you are a place like a Sunderland or a Wakefield or a Doncaster, for example, places which are very concentrated or dependent on one industry now, I think the question should be, given that their economies are fairly weak, if not about how do we double down on what we've got on our key strength already, but should be like, what have we not got, and why is that the case, and what should we try to do about it? And then even in a place like Reading or Aldershot, where they are paying very high wages, but they are very dependent on an industry, but just tends to be, or is the case, that industry is riding the crest of a wave currently, which is IT and communications. What does that then mean for 15 years' time if the economy does move on and that part isn't quite so as important as what it is now? That poses a challenge for those places too. Now, I think what is interesting for both those places is that if you look at the cutting edge of the economy, and how much of these green shoots has it got in the part of the economy that is in its infancy but probably will drive future growth, actually Reading and Aldershot do pretty well on that front, which might tell you something about their ability to pivot. A lot of service companies there already as well, where it's probably easier to pivot into different areas. Yeah. Whereas in a place like Wakefield or Doncaster, for example, there is a question there about when you then look at other parts of those 5 things that we looked at and look at share of or number of new economy firms, number of cutting edge firms that they have, also suggests that if those places did want to pivot, they probably haven't got enough of those emerging areas of the economy to pivot, which again, I think raises a couple of red flags about how specialised they are in what they might see as key strengths now. So again, the risk of labouring this, we really do think this is an important point for places to think about. And it's not just a case of, we looked at the composition of our economy, we've got lots of this, let's talk about this. Go beyond that. Scratch away at the surface and think about, well, what have we not got? Why have we not got it? And what does that then mean from a policy perspective? Because it's probably that bit which is having the impact on our performance, on wages in an area, which ultimately we all want to increase.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've had a few questions on, I suppose, how cities relate to each other. And particularly, several questions when you look at some of the high-performing cities in and around, they're in the greater southeast. Many of them are in and around London itself. Mm-hmm. And so there's a question about the relationship between London on the one hand, in this instance, and other places around it, whether that's Aldershot, whether that's Reading, whether that's Milton Keynes, etc. So there's something going on, when you think about the regional scale and whether there's something similar to be said about what's going on in the northeast or elsewhere. So your thoughts on that, Paul? We've looked very specifically at the relationship between cities and towns, so cities and their hinterlands, smaller places that are essentially providing places for people to live, even if they work somewhere else. But just your thoughts on, when we think about that kind of greater southeast performance, is it about the London penumbra, borrowing from London, and what then does that mean for other small cities elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's much harder to look at business links than it is commuter links. So the getting under the skin of this question is not straightforward. But I think if we look at to some degree, the composition of firms that you get in some of those places around London probably tells us something about some of the sorting that is going on. So if we look at, let's pick out advanced manufacturing, because that will probably be written into most local growth plans as well, because I think we fetishize easy for me to say.
That's an easy word to say, yeah.
That industry to some degree, which is not without merit, but we also need to be a bit careful about how far we do that. And a lot of we've got a chart in the report on this. If you look at the distribution of advanced manufacturing firms across the country, quite a lot of them are in those great southeast, not in the north, but in those areas in the great southeast that are around London. Now, I think a degree to that would be those companies are looking for access to lots of high-skilled workers, which the great southeast provides, but also looking for access to a degree of space as well, because advanced manufacturing needs more space than a fintech firm or whatever it might be. And so they're not necessarily based within London, they're based a little bit further out in some of these urban centres. So I think you're getting a degree of that going on. But also these places are pretty strong performing places in their own right. They're offering a number of advantages, one of which might be access to London, but another one is skills, housing stock, etc., which makes them attractive places for businesses to come in and invest in. So I think the London story is part of it, but it isn't necessarily all of it. If you then take that story further north, though, we tend to have this discussion about how the performance of one place basically eats the dinner of another place. But the Great South East suggests that's not the case. So the challenge for the north of England is in particular, as I was trying to stress with those potential charts, is about how to try and get Manchester to perform better, Leeds to perform better, Liverpool to perform better. And if you sort of take that logic in terms of what's going on from the Greater South East, that probably would make cities and large towns around those places ultimately perform a little bit better as well, or certainly wouldn't necessarily eat into their prosperity. We then do also know from the other work that we've done that from a commuting perspective, that these big places do spread prosperity. They just don't generate enough in the first place to spread as much as what we would like. That definitely happens in the Greater South East. It doesn't happen so much elsewhere. And so again, trying to improve the performance of big places like Manchester, like Birmingham, I think is really important for that wider regional prosperity that we want to see and that the government wants to see as well.
Yeah, you didn't mention it so much in your presentation, but some of the comments and or the questions come from readers obviously have read the report, which is nice because they talk a little bit about the housing question which we raise, and housing costs particularly, and the role of housing, how you think about that and its role in the economy at the moment, but also in the future. So it's probably worth just saying a little bit more about how we address that specifically in the report. The obvious point, some of our places that pay higher wages also have higher housing costs, particularly when you're looking at house prices and house affordability. So it's probably just worth saying something on that, Paul, your thoughts on that, not least it's in the report. And then there's another question which you come to, which is the chicken and egg nature between quality of a place to live in versus quality of a place to work in. And I know those things maybe not are not versus, but just helpful to think about that. So just say a little bit about how we address the housing question and housing costs, particularly in the report.
So unsurprisingly and quite rightly, and we were considering this as we were doing the work as well, we've had a number of comments back today about, but what about housing costs? It's much more expensive to live in a Reading than it is in a place like Burnley. Yeah, exactly right. But the key thing within this is to remember is that those high housing costs, in large part, are a policy choice. And that we've decided not to build enough houses in Reading, enough houses in Aldershot, enough houses in London, which then means that affordability has worsened as a result. So it's not as if these things just happen sort of in a vacuum and there's nothing that policy can do about it. Basically, what's happening in a place like London or Reading is that these wages are flowing into people's pockets and then they're flowing straight back out again into the pockets of landlords. Now, if you own your own home, maybe you're quite happy about that, or there's no negative impact on that. But if you're a renter, that's a big challenge. Or if you're somebody trying to access the prosperity that's available in some of these places, that's a big challenge because it provides a barrier to the people moving there and trying to get paid the wages that are on offer in that place. So I don't think we should lose sight of that. Now, yes, clearly somebody after housing costs is probably in a better position in Burnley than the raw wage data suggests. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing something about housing. It also doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing something about wages, because I think there are very few people that would argue that somebody in Reading or somebody in London isn't better, on average, isn't better off than they are in Burnley. And in fact, that's why we spend so much time in policy circles trying to think about how do you improve the performance of the North Midlands and Wales of England for precisely that reason, even though housing costs are lower. And I think if we frame this just totally in terms of productivity, that question probably wouldn't have come up. We frame it in terms of wages, and then all of a sudden that question does come up, even though the housing point stands throughout. And so there are a number of things there for us to think about why it's then important and to be thinking about wages, but also why it's important to be thinking about a number of different parts of what policy should be trying to do, because it's not just a case of increased wages and that's okay. It is this element about the role that housing and indeed the supply commercial space plays in the performance of places too.
Yeah, so and that takes us on, again, a couple of questions about the relationship between the quality of life offer in some respects, and then the quality of work or career progression, job progression, and those two things, and how those two aspects interrelate. And obviously some of the points you see, and not least it's come up more in questions about working patterns and have they changed, is the extent to which places can become prosperous again on the back of offering themselves as being good places to live, right? And actually, for those of you that don't, Tim Loyndig's got quite an interesting blog recently looking at what he thinks towns should really focus on, which is actually to be good, boring places to live and to live the normal life, as it were, if there is such a thing as that. So there's something interesting around how you think about these sorts of different factors.
So ultimately, if someone is of working age and needs to work, a place can be a lovely place to live, but if it hasn't got access to prosperity, either in that place itself or somewhere nearby, then I think there's a little bit of a challenge there. So, I don't know, a place like the Cotswolds, for example, where maybe a lot of people retire to, and therefore that link with the economy breaks. You do have places that have got, that are a very nice place to live, although define what exactly that means. It means different things to different people. They are able to be sort of very affluent places, despite not having sort of that access to prosperity on the doorstep. Although I'm sure there's still quite a lot of commuting into into London 2 or 3 days a week. The challenge for a number of places elsewhere is that you've got to have that prosperity first. So a lot of people talk about Margate, for example, about what can we learn from Margate? Well, part of the reason why Margate is starting to be able to become a more attractive place to live is because people can get into London and earn the London wage. I think if you're looking at a number of places around a place that doesn't perform as well as what it should, like a Sheffield, like a Liverpool, like a Newcastle, you haven't got as many prosperous towns and villages around it because you haven't got that prosperity engine there first. And just improving the attractiveness of that place to live without improving the overall amount of prosperity on the table probably means that you're trying to seal people basically from the next prosperous town or village without actually seeing the size of the pie grow. I think on the flip side of that, you look at a place like Slough, for example, where wages are very high, but there's a question about the quality of the housing stock, and you do get a lot of incommuting into Slough. There is an issue there about how to try and improve the quality of standard of living, standard of housing stock, whatever term you want to use and whatever that actually means, in a place like Slough. But it has got that engine there in the first place, and it's got London on the doorstep, which probably means that focus on housing will probably have a greater impact than in a place where itself is struggling, or indeed its nearest large town or city is struggling, and trying to focus on that element and not ignoring that element for, we'll just make ourselves a nice place to live and everything will be okay.
Yeah, quite. I think, given some of the questions, worth coming back to almost towards the end of the slides at least, where we talk a little bit about potential and what we think about, what we mean by that, and particularly, several questions about, inequality between places, and in a future scenario, what would that look like? Be useful, I think, just to unpack that and maybe go through that again. What we do know when we look at urban areas and the performance of different urban areas across the country, two things always stick out, I think, when you compare to lots of other places. One is that the variation between places is quite large, often larger than in many other comparable countries, so the differences between places is pretty big. And then within that, as we've already said on many occasions, it's a notable outlier that our bigger cities don't perform as well as they could or as they should, given their international comparators. And that in itself, the differential between, let's say, London in this instance and Manchester is bigger in the UK than it often is when you look at other countries as well. So just say a little bit more about that potential issue and what we think, if everywhere was getting closer to the potential, what would that look like when we then looked at the variation map across the country? Yeah.
So if every place performed at its potential, for those places that are struggling, that's more money in people's pockets in absolute terms, and that is a good thing, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Yeah. And I think we do get sucked into sometimes this relative element of, well, if I'm not as prosperous as the next place along, then this is all a bad thing. Putting more money in the pockets of people in Burnley, which we think policy has got some scope to do, is something that it should definitely be trying to aim for. I think the issue is just, what is it you think you can achieve? Now, there are very few places in the country that probably couldn't attract an investment bank in, certainly in the near future, and smaller places like Wakefield or Burnley probably aren't it. Well, that doesn't mean that you can't attract in some cutting edge companies and try and improve the performance of that place. Where you are probably going to attract in a greater share of those, or should be attracting a greater share of those cutting edge companies, is in a place like Manchester, is in a place like Birmingham, which as a big city should be offering a certain range of benefits. Now, we know from the performance, as you said, Andrew, of similar sized cities in other Western European, well, in fact, other G7 economies, that these big cities are playing that role. They are offering that benefit, but that isn't the case in the UK. And it's the underperformance of these big places, which we've noted through our work, was then noted in the Levelling Up White Paper, has been noted now in the Industrial Strategy Green Paper too. It's the underperformance of those places that are probably having the biggest drag on the performance of the UK economy, certainly over a 20 or a 30-year period. The important thing, though, within this, which gets to the real heart of the question, is that we would still see, because we've got varying potential and different places have different potentials, the best version of one place is not the same as the performance, the best version of another, is that we would still see inequality between these places. It's just the nature of that inequality will probably be different to what it is currently. we're not satisfied with the variation we see across the country currently, but we want to change that. But even in the utopia, you would still see variation across the country. You see difference in performance between different places. But the key thing is that all places are performing better, and the biggest places in particular are generating a whole load more prosperity than is currently the case. So we have to spread that prosperity more. So while inequality in terms of places as place of production varies, so Manchester city centre in particular seeing more of the national economy within it, Liverpool city centre in particular seeing more of the economy within it, the prosperity that generates then to spread around then means that you're probably doing something about regional inequality as a result, because people commute. They're then taking their wages back to the town or village around those places, which is then boosting prosperity in a much wider area.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We've got a couple of minutes. We've got loads of questions. Try to cover as many as we can, but it's just because it's partly the way we talk about it. But so Andy Neely, should we focus on attracting in companies in a literal sense, or should we be concentrating on creating and building new companies, or I guess you also by definition mean existing companies to expand and grow, i.e. the innovation entrepreneurship agenda? Clearly it's not either or, but relatively where should we think about that effort? I mean, it's a good point in some respects about how you think about the economies, and it is a bit of, it is everything, but again goes back to your point about if you don't have a firm base that is enabled to grow because it's in certain industries that are likely to grow, then you're going to have to literally look outside or to new entrants to provide you with some of that. Some of that.
I mean, I think the very short answer to that is: do we think that the barriers to indigenous firms is different to the barriers to firms from outside coming to invest in? The answer is probably not. I think if you do solve some of those barriers as to why all these firms are not coming to invest, you probably deal with that issue. Now, you could say, well, a bit more specifically, well, shouldn't we go out and do some more inward investment type work? I mean, maybe, if this firm doesn't know the advantages that exist within a place, then yes, maybe you want to go and do that, because firms based in and around the city already know about it, firms from outside don't. So you can see why it might have a bit of emphasis there. But in general, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference in terms of between those two groups, why they invest or they don't invest.
Yeah, great. We could go on, but we can't. It's 1 o'clock. We need to finish. Thank you all for joining today. I hope you found that useful. I said the presentation, the video will be on the website along with the report, the data tool, the podcast, and various blogs looking at different aspects of it. So please go to centreforcities.org and consume all of the activity and material in relation to Cities Outlook 2025. But until the next time, take care and stay safe.